y'all. It's Andrew with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans.
And Robi with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans.
And we got James magically maneuvering the camera back there. We're gonna take y'all today on a bike ride up the Mississippi. This is gonna be a scenic exploration of the river as well as to a lot of historic sites along it. And it's the first in our series that we're beginning, doing a road trip up the river.
I'm really excited about this. This is gonna be really good, y'all.
Yeah, this is gonna take us to some really unprecedented stories, not the kind of stuff we've been able to tell y'all in the past.
Yeah.
And this first day, it's gonna be things that you could explore even just without leaving New Orleans at all. You could do this as a bike trip. You could get via a short drive to any of the sites that we're gonna show you. So even if you don't plan on doing a road trip yourself, these are things to keep on your itinerary, possibly if you're gonna be exploring New Orleans on a trip of your own sometime soon. So as we go, we're gonna see all kinds of stuff. There's the river itself, which is incredibly beautiful. And we're also gonna spend some time in one of the best riverfront parks. We're gonna see plantation houses. We're gonna see a lot of what keeps Louisiana pumping, a lot of the industries that employ a lot of folks here. And we're gonna see some great trees, which is what we are starting with. This particular tree, y'all, we call it the Tree of Life, and it's very much a hangout space in town. People come and just like climb the tree, all different ages. You see weddings underneath it all the time. If you get at the right angle, you can also get a glimpse over the fence into the Audubon Zoo. Right now, we're next to Audubon Park, awesome outdoor space to visit on our way to the Fly, which is where we're gonna really begin our ride. But this tree, the Tree of Life, is a real standout for a reason of its membership in an elite organization. There's a group in Louisiana called the Live Oak Society, and if you trust the Constitution that the Live Oak Society has written, the membership of the society is made up completely of trees, and the Constitution was written by trees. There's only one human member, which is the acting secretary, who I guess writes things down when the trees say them. So this is some fun that was had by some tree-loving preservationists, but they founded this society and they included a few dozen trees in Louisiana, specifically live oak trees like this one, as members in it. And what they were choosing was the biggest and therefore generally the oldest tree. Like, this tree is in probably the range of 250 to 300 years based on its size. And so it might have seen the origins of New Orleans, and possibly even going further back, certainly some of them are much older. So this was a founding member of the Live Oak Society.
Ain't that something, y'all?
Now y'all know.
Now you know, the more you know.
Learning some prestigious company during this tour.
One story I would love to share with you guys, especially about an oak tree this big and this old. Back on the plantations, back in the 1700s and 1800s, when all this slavery stuff was going on, a lot of the house slaves were very resentful over their slave owners, especially after they passed away. But they were also invited to go to the funerals as well. So a lot of the house slaves were all lined up right beside the casket of the slave owner, and they were lined up specifically to show how loyal they were to the slave owner. Little did his dead behind know. As they were lowering the casket down, normally what happens is the family members will throw in some flowers, they throw in some trinkets or whatever it may be, and a bunch of slaves will do the same thing. But hidden amongst the trinkets, hidden amongst the flowers are acorns. So as they're lowering the slave owner down and saying the Bible verses and whatnot, the slaves will throw these things in there and hope and pray that the oak tree would actually sprout. The idea is the oak tree, as it grows, it ensnares and entangles the slave owner's soul. So he won't even have freedom even after he passed away, because they've been enslaved their entire lives while they've been alive. And there are a lot of oak trees that probably got a bunch of dead, old, racist, slave-owning people at the bottom of them to this day. That's why I love trees like this, because you never know what's underneath.
The next stop for us is going to be around, still on the Audubon Institute property, this park that we call the Fly, and that's going to get us within view of the river for the first time. So here that comes. Ready to ride off? I'm
excited, yes. Let's go do it.
All right, we're going to ride, y'all. Bring your helmets if you decide to do this yourself. There's bike rentals all over town. And we'll give you the reasons why we're doing this by bike, even though you could do it by car. We'll argue why this is the best way to do it soon.
Trust us, this is the best way to do this.
Off we go?
Yes, let's go.
All right, y'all, first stop. This is Audubon Riverview Park. No one calls it that. This is the Fly. So just a big outdoor hangout up against the river, and it is not close enough to the French Quarter that most visitors know about it, but people in Uptown, like, this is where you go for outdoor hangout space. Not necessarily to run or maybe play sports, but not mainly to exercise, just to exist.
So, you know, some of you have taken tours with us in person, and this is one of the places that we actually recommend after our tours that you stop by that's kind of not of a tourist trap. You'll find more college kids out here actually relaxing after class or having a picnic just to get out and get away from studying and stuff like that. And this is the perfect spot for that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a really fun place to go. It's one of the few places you can actually see the river from in town. Mostly the river is blocked with port infrastructure. And it also is the former site of a couple of plantations. And you would not have the slightest idea of that looking at it now.
There's nothing left.
No vestiges at all. And that's actually the norm with these plantations. So like plantation houses, when you see old property maps up and down the Mississippi and other bodies of water in Louisiana, it was solid plantations all up and down the river, like very little distance between them. But it's not uncommon that you don't see these houses anymore, but this is one that was really noted in its day. We'll see some that are still standing, but this one, the two plantations that stood where this was, one of them, the Atenda Beret plantation, after which the Tree of Life is quote unquote officially named, that was the one where successful sugar cultivation in Louisiana was first accomplished late in the 18th century. And that changed the world here. Like, sugar's a big deal in Louisiana, economically today, but also just culturally.
Culturally, if you love your rum, then you got to be thankful for that sugar cane, baby. Because actually, you know, rum is a byproduct of, after they process the sugar and everything, what's left over, they make rum out of it.
Yeah, and you know, chewing on sugar cane,
oh
yes, a common thing.
Yeah, in St. Francisville, which we're gonna be visiting soon. I grew up actually, where I grew up, we chew sugar cane just like candy. You know, it's just like, oh, sugar cane, and here come my uncle with the sugar cane on the back of the truck, because he used to have to fix the fences out there, and he'd bring some random sugar cane and be like, here you go, children. And then he'd be mad because we'd be climbing the walls later from the sugar rush.
So there's a lot of really, I mean, heritage of a sort that comes from this spot, and that, you know, changed the world of South Louisiana into this present day. We're going to see some of that as we go up, not as much of the agrarian world, but some plantations that still exist, a lot of the things that have replaced them. And we're going to be doing that via our bikes.
I'm excited to show y'all this. Hopefully I don't get too tired on the way, but y'all bear with me because Andrew got more leg muscles than I have.
Same number, but
they're stronger.
We've been doing this for a little while. You got this. You got this. And one of the advantages of this, y'all, like the places we're going to be going, this is stuff that you could see by car. You can visit these destinations by car, but the bike gives you this scenic advantage. You can take things slow. You can see the river and that whole side the whole way along. Take the bike. Take it. The advantage you might not think about too is like, it's a counterintuitive thing, but when you ride on the bike path, you're on the Mississippi River levee. So you are boosted above. It's the highest elevation in the city. It's very rare to get an elevated view in New Orleans. So you can actually look down onto New Orleans the whole time and be able to see historic neighborhoods, be able to see, you know, all these, the live oak trees that we talked about, and just get a kind of leisurely distant view on all that stuff. It's really hard to beat.
And there's a lot of spots on the river, just like Andrew said too, where you can see bits and pieces of the city. For instance, you can see other cities from the levee. You literally can be biking on the levee and you're in New Orleans and you can see the next city over and then the next city across the river, all in one spot. So it's definitely worth the bike ride.
As we go, we're gonna pass by the very first thing on the path, which begins here in the Fly and goes upriver from here. We're going to see the local headquarters of the Army Corps of Engineers, which is responsible for building and maintaining the kinds of levees like we're standing near right now. So they are right next to their own biggest project. And I think it's pure coincidence that their headquarters is located on Leek Avenue, but apropos in a small way. So we'll be passing by that and then getting to a spot where you can actually see where people live along the river. So that's going to be a real novelty, super unusual even here. And we'll be riding to that first thing. Y'all, we've arrived in a little section of the riverfront that is actually residences, and this is a small strip that's a vestige of there having been a whole lot more of these at one time. Today, they're in this weird little legal situation where You can have one, but it's really, really unusual to see them built now, at least in New Orleans.
Now, if you go outside of New Orleans, especially back where we come from, and we won't get to see on this trip, but there's a lot of people who actually have houses on the river. It's actually a common thing. Back where I come from, the part of St. Francis that I live on, we actually used to have little makeshift sheds or shacks on the river, but the idea is that the river will take them sooner or later, so you don't really put a lot of energy into the building itself. It's actually pretty awesome to see like permanent housing out here, right here on the river. And right now the water's high and they're still here.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a little bit of fondness for that, outdoors life for the people who live here, but there's also this privacy that's just kind of unprecedented in the city. Like you are on one side of the levee and you are in town, and then you get to the other side and you have this quiet sort of rural seeming existence. And I remember I did this ride a little bit back, and right around here on this side of the levee, I saw a kid playing a trombone. And it was like, you can just imagine someone in his house was like, get that noise out of here, go over across the levee. And so you have this secluded, quiet space just right next to the city, which is just not a thing that's available.
One of my favorite things, especially where we are right now, is that you literally are standing between two worlds. Right here on my right, there's like river houses, and you can see the river, you can see the factory across on the other side of the river. On my left is full-blown New Orleans, uptown. And it's such a large contrast between the two worlds that are like sitting right beside each other. Literally one long giant hill separating these two. And I don't even know if you can hear right now, and I'm having some nostalgic moments. There's some black gospel music being played in the air, and it's kind of like a callback to home from the bayou, and I love it. I'm in my feelings right now, y'all. I'm in my feelings. Cool. All right, we're gonna take y'all further down. Stay with us. Oh, sorry.
All along the way, it's worth pointing out, you have this naturally accruing land between the river and the levee. There's this slower lying land that you can actually build a house on. The Fly doesn't have that. You have this open view of the river there, but for most of it, there's going to be trees between the levee and the river, and that's just nature. So the view looking out towards the river a lot of times is a view of like woods more than it's a view of just the water itself. It does open up once in a while, but that's something to expect out of this ride, is to see a little bit of nature of various kinds. Now, we just came down off the levee into one of the spots that I think really makes the difference in whether you bike this or something else. Because in a typical trip around New Orleans, if you're just going out to the suburbs to get some stuff, you're likely to come by this intersection, and all you're gonna know is there's a plaque and a cannon and a big old monument here, and it's a bunch of different war memorials, but there's no time. I mean, I'm a devoted plaque reader, and there is no time on a drive to read the plaques here and nearby and catch really what an important spot this is. And it was in advance of doing this bike trip that I finally gave these things a solid reading for the first time, and I learned some super cool stuff. So the plaque that you see as you come by here says Camp Parapet, and it's describing this Civil War fortification that started here, and it actually runs way, way out Causeway Boulevard. It's the reason why Causeway Boulevard is where it is. So there was this long, narrow fort, and this started off during the American Civil War belonging to the Confederacy, so the southern side in the war that New Orleans was a part of at the very beginning. And the idea was they were gonna fend off any invasion from the north. So if the United States came attacking downriver, this would hold them off. And the United States never did that. They attacked from upriver. They came from below. They occupied New Orleans really early on. So the United States takes over this fort. And they in turn are prepared to defend this land against an attack from north. But that never happens either. Who comes here is escaped enslaved people who are taking the war as an opportunity to get away. And they come down and they report to this fort, and they basically offer themselves up as volunteers and say, I know what's at stake here, let me help out. And a lot of these people, it seems like from what we can tell, they would have wanted to be involved in the war in a military way, but on Confederate or United States sides, there was this deep skepticism about the ability of Black people and mixed race people, and especially enslaved people, to contribute to a war, to show the kind of valor that, performance in battle they believed would take, even though it had happened here several times before. So the thing one of the kind of counter examples that really disproved that was this guy, Andre Caillou, and he was part of a group that formed here because eventually, when enough of these enslaved people came in, there was the free people of color in town, and a black and mixed race military division was formed here called the Native Guard. And one of its members was this guy, Andre Caillou, and he's one of like the great New Orleans Civil War heroes. So Andre Caillou is a great example of what an enslaved person was capable of. He was 21 when he was freed from slavery, so he spent his whole youth in slavery. Like a lot of urban slaves, he ended up being taught a trade, so he was a cigar maker. And when he was freed at age 21, he went into business for himself, bought a lot of land, became pretty prosperous, and like got married, had a child, all the signs of a good life, you know? So Andre Caillou has all of this stuff going for him, but he's in the Native Guard, and he's in originally the Confederate Native Guard, never sees battle there, joins the United States Native Guard, and ends up being part of the Battle of Port Hudson. So there's this battle site this battlefield near where we grew up called Port Hudson, and it's a famous spot. It's one of the biggest battles in the Civil War. And when the United States forces went to capture it from the Confederacy, basically out of this skepticism about what the Native Guard was going to be good for, they were sent to do this virtually impossible mission. And for the people involved, there was really no choice but to either retreat and self-preserve and be seen as a coward, or to do the thing they were told to do at enormous cost, but to prove other people wrong in the process. And Andre Caillou was a captain, so he had decisions to make, and he led the charge, and he got wounded several times, crying onwards, forwards, all throughout, and he died on that battlefield. And so it was a month and change before his body was finally removed, and he got this heroic funeral here as this guy who disproved the notion of what people like him were capable of. And it was on his back and that of others that later in the Civil War, other black soldiers were able to do much more successful feats of valor that weren't self-sacrifices like that.
It's such a sensitive thing to talk about because even today in 2021, people still think that way about people of color in general. Like the fact that we have darker skin means that we are incapable of doing a lot of things. And honestly, to hear a story like that coming from you and how this gentleman actually did what he did is kind of inspiring to me, just to keep on going with even this, what we're doing right now. So I appreciate that story. I really do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's one that I don't think a lot of us here know.
I didn't know that story, y'all. I didn't. And it's really touching.
And the fort, in turn, it leads on to this whole other surprising story to me. So Camp Parapet doesn't survive except in the form of there's a powder magazine around the way, this kind of storage area, and then their cemetery survived and went into use for these two different black churches in the area. And this became kind of a black suburb called Shrewsbury. And a little ways further out, as you do the drive or the bike ride, you pass by another plaque that commemorates the landmark of Shrewsbury, which was Marsalis Mansion Motel. And a lot of people, when they hear the word Marsalis,
okay, of course,
they think about the jazz musicians.
Music, baby.
Absolutely. So like Ellis Marsalis, the great jazz pianist who passed away last year through COVID-19. His four sons, all extremely accomplished musicians. But this was the establishment of Ellis Marsalis Sr., Ellis Marsalis, the pianist's father. And it was a motel out on this street. And back then, so y'all will likely know the story of the Green Book, this thing that if black travelers would consult to know where they could go safely if they were on the road. If you looked at the Green Book and you were looking at the section for New Orleans, the very first thing you saw in huge print was the Marsalis Mansion Motel. It was like the safe place to go. And musicians, civil rights activists, all kinds of big names ended up lodging there at different points. So it was this landmark of the neighborhood. People were in demand to perform down in the French Quarter who could not legally stay in a hotel in the French Quarter. And so they'd come out here and stay there afterwards. And so Ellis Marsalis Sr. runs this place alongside being the first franchisee who was black of an Esso station in the state, all these other achievements, along with registering lots of voters. And the crazy thing was eventually, when the Civil Rights Act passed, a lot of black-owned businesses suffered because all of a sudden, black consumers had more options, and going to a business you couldn't go to before was this sign of liberation. And the Marsalis Mansion Motel, after a couple decades in business of booming times from the 40s into the 60s, ends up really kind of dropping off, and it gets shut down and torn down in the 80s and 90s, such that there's nothing to see there anymore. It's this like little strip mall with a historical plaque in front of it that I never paused to read.
Wow.
And if y'all decide to see these things, because like if you're the kind of tourist who travels out to see plaques for things that don't exist anymore, then you are an unusually good tourist, so you deserve to reward yourself. And a little bit past those things is the Rivershack Tavern, which is a very vintage looking, 1940s style bar and restaurant with some live music a great deal of the time. So you can get a facade that feels very much of the era when at least that second landmark was in its heyday. And spending some time there, give yourself a break from the ride and get back up with fresh and renewed energy.
I like that.
You feeling energized?
Y'all, my legs feel like spaghetti, but we're gonna keep on going. We're gonna keep on going.
Spaghetti's great.
Spaghetti's good to eat. I can
right.
eat some spaghetti right now.
We've jumped a good distance ahead in the ride out to what people in New Orleans know as Kenner, and I guess people traveling here would probably just know as the area around the airport. So it is mostly something that if you're traveling, you really only see in terms of airport vicinity, but sometimes people come visiting out here, oftentimes on the way to the flight or during a delayed flight. So you do have a little historic district here at the riverfront of it that's called Rivertown. And they have this space commemorating the founding of Kenner, for one thing, which is 1850s, but also commemorating some older stuff. This actually dates from 1984 for the most part, but it goes back to some of the earliest European connected events in the area. So famously, before New Orleans was ever developed, Louisiana, big Louisiana that was the entire Mississippi River Valley, was claimed by France through this man named René Robert Cavalier Sieur de Lasalle, who we just call Lasalle most of the time, in 1682. And this is about where he landed, somewhere in this vicinity. And he claimed Louisiana by setting up a huge cypress cross here. And that cross doesn't exist anymore. And so in order to commemorate the site, the city of Kenner puts in a wooden monument with a plaque depicting that event. And at this point, that wooden monument is no longer there, and now there's just a plaque. So we have, in this spot called LaSalle's Landing, a missing monument to a missing monument, and it just kind of grabs the atmosphere of the place. This is a spot that was set up with really big ambitions, but has become a little neglected over the years. And the most pristine piece of it is going to be the statue of the two boxers. This is her bare-knuckle fisticuffs artists. They were the contestants in the, let's see if I can say this right, the first ever world championship heavyweight prize fight to happen in the United States.
That's a mouthful.
All those world records, you got to say them in just the right way.
Yeah.
So one of them was the American heavyweight champion, and the other one was the English heavyweight champion. And America plus England equals the world, apparently. So when they fought against each other, it was a world title. 1870 happened on this site. So that's the most significant stuff right around here. Although, if you were to pay this a visit, you would also see there's the Kenner Planetarium, which has a full-size prototype of the International Space Station. And you also have Rivertown Repertory Theater out here, which is one of the most regularly producing theaters in the city. There's an old high school, Kenner High School from the 1920s along the street, and it really jumps out as you do the bike ride. And it hasn't been used since the 90s, but there was this effort in the years that followed to turn it into something new. And a historical plaque was put in front of it, and this was in 2008, and there were big plans to make something happen until in 2018, some kids were hanging out in there at night, and they lit a couch on fire, and the entire building went up in flames. So if you ever do this ride or this drive, then you're definitely going to see a very standout, like architecturally somewhat remarkable, burned out building on the side of the road with a very out of place historical plaque in front of it. So there are present day reasons to come here, but Kenner is definitely a place that has tried hard and had some setbacks. Speaking of trying hard and setbacks, we have something else on that theme.
Revolution. Haiti is one of the only countries in the entire world that's ever earned their independence from slavery through a revolution and succeeded. And even though they did succeed, France still had ties to Haiti because France owned Haiti. But word of these people of color, enslaved and non-enslaved African people, Creole people, people with mixed heritage, earning their freedom and claiming a country for themselves, of course, that's gonna spread all across the world, especially here in New Orleans in the New World. And all these people who are enslaved are hearing about what happened in Haiti. And of course, we had our own few revolutions actually happening here. One in the early 1800s, which I'll let you explain that.
Sure. So revolution was kind of in the air around this time. A lot of the European powers and who they controlled were at play. Actually, in our very hometown, which we'll be seeing in a future installment in this series, there was a quick little moment of it being part of its own very small, short-lived country. And so you had this kind of permeating sense of change being possible. And yeah, in 1811, we have the largest slave revolt in terms of the number of people participating that ever happened in the United States. And it started a little further along the river in the course of where we're going to go and made it to about here. So this was a gradually growing group of people. It started off with a couple dozen enslaved people on one plantation. You're talking mostly like young men in their 20s and 30s. And led by this man named Charles Disland, who was he was himself a slave driver. He was one of the people who was somewhat closer to the owner of the plantation, was trusted with the supervisory duties, but also organized this rebellion. And one night in January, shortly after the sugar crop had been harvested, and when things got quieter on the plantation, he and his co-conspirators came into the house, wounded the owner of the plantation, killed his son. The owner escapes, but they begin to work their way through the plantations along the river, gathering forces. And the ultimate size of the crowd ends up being somewhere from a couple hundred to maybe as many as 500. And because that man, the owner of that plantation where the whole thing began, survives and makes it across the river despite an axe wound, word gets over across the river. A militia of Creole folks, white Creole folks, is mustered over there, where it also makes it down to New Orleans. And the governor of Louisiana at that time, William C.C. Claiborne, of what is then called the Territory of Orleans, sends federal forces, first time federal forces have ever been deployed to control a slave revolt, coming this way and also coming down the river from Baton Rouge. So there was a three-way attack coming to surround these people. That's the part of it that happened here. We'll get to a further chapter of that story as we get further along the river to where it happened. So we're going to head out from here, pass by the airport, and really get out of what we even consider the New Orleans metro area. Yeah, we've just reached Destrehan Plantation. This is one of the first sights you get when you get into the town of Destrehan. And a little further along, there's more of a historic strip where you'd see the church that is part of the second oldest Catholic parish in Louisiana, and its cemetery, which has burials from back in the 18th century. Jean-Noël Destrehan is actually a character in a story that we've already touched on. So the 1811 slave revolt, well, it started north of us and it was turned back south of us. It ended up stopping pretty near here, just a little ways further along the river. So federal forces As you might remember, we're closing it in from either side, coming from New Orleans and coming from Baton Rouge. But ultimately, it was this white Creole militia coming across the Mississippi, led by the man who was nearly killed by the revolt at the very beginning, that ended up actually meeting them. And there was an absolute massacre. Those who survived that attack were subjected to a few different tribunals throughout the area, and one of them took place here on the front gallery of this house. Jean-Noel Destrehan and a few other members of the planter class became these unofficial judges and condemned this huge number of people to be killed by a firing squad. And Charles Deslandes, the guy who headed up the whole small revolution, was ultimately tortured and burned at these grounds. That is a objectively huge piece of the history of this place. But if you'd visited this place a few years ago, it's not a part of the story that you would have been told. It's really common among these plantation house tours to have a story that's focused entirely on the appearance of the house, the decorative arts of the things inside the house, and the biography of the family that lived inside of the house, mostly leaving out the story of the huge majority of people who did the physical work on the plantations. That has been the case for most of the time that plantations have been a place to visit for tourists. Just in the last decade or so, though, there's really started to be a change in that world. And Destrehan's a good example of that, where as of when I first visited here, those things like I mentioned are all you really would have heard about. But in 2011, to commemorate the 200th anniversary of that slave revolt, they partnered with the African American Museum in New Orleans, and they created a permanent exhibition on this site that talks just about the revolt, and they do talks about that subject just about every day. And they also, in addition to their regular tour that I've already described the flavor of, they also have a periodic tour that they do that focuses on the people who did the work, not just in terms of the work they did, but also in terms of their religious life, their food, their day-to-day culture, and also the kinds of crafts that they would have done, which are still demonstrated here on a daily basis too. So there's kind of a hybrid model going on here. Who knows whether that's the end of that story? We're going to get a lot more into this as we get further up the river for our second episode of this series, which is going to get into plantations you could visit besides this one in the New Orleans area and the different focal points that each of them has. So there's going to be more on this pretty soon.
Y'all, it's actually thanks to y'all. It's thanks to a lot of people who are angry about only hearing about the furniture, only hearing about the family who own these plantations. It's all thanks to people just like coming out and saying, hey, this is not okay. Talk about slavery, talk about life as a slave. And that's why a lot of plantations now are actually starting to focus on the people who were actually slaves on the plantation and how their day-to-day life was. We'll speak more about that when we do the plantation videos for you guys, but it's important. So continue to say, hey, talk more about slavery when y'all visit places like this. Especially if you go to a plantation and they're hosting tours and all they focus on is the furniture and also the beauty of the house and the family dynamic. It's okay to ask them, hey, can you talk a little bit more about slavery? That's why we came. That's very important to speak up.
To that point, part of the year of events that these guys hosted for the bicentennial of that slave revolt, one of the many things they did was they had these workshops for tour guides who want to do better, but who are kind of part of an oral tradition at a lot of these houses. The story is passed down orally, and these folks know, oftentimes because of what they've received, that they're just not equipped with the knowledge to do a better job on that front. And so that kind of ongoing education at a place like this is really important for tour guides who oftentimes are relying more on what they've been told than sometimes what they've read. All different kinds of tour guides out there, don't mean to make too much of a general image, but oftentimes that's how it happens. There's a couple other really important stories from here, y'all, that add up to a picture of what post-slavery life was gonna look like on plantations. And the first of them actually happened, this effort to make a post-slavery community here in the years before the Civil War, during the antebellum period. So one of the owners of this house after Jean-Noel Destrehan was a man named Stephen Henderson, a Scottish guy. And he wrote in his will this elaborate plan by which over the 25 years following his death, all of the enslaved people on this plantation, numbering more than 100, would be gradually liberated. And when each person got liberated, they would have the option either to be sent to Liberia at the estate's expense, or if they didn't want to leave behind all the people and places they had ever known, they could stay here. And a factory was going to be opened on the ground, he decided, producing clothing and shoes, and the people who wanted to stay could work there for pay. And at the end of that 25-year process, his idea was all of the land would be partitioned and turned into a private city. And the idea, I guess, it's not totally clear in the will, was that those enslaved people formerly would by then be able to afford to own those lots themselves. So this was a really unusual, really ambitious idea. And when you're coloring outside the lines like that, you gotta dot your I's and cross your T's. And Stephen Henderson did not do that. In his will, he dedicated big chunks of it to chewing out members of his family and talking about their drinking habits and stuff. It's a little bit of a cringy read. And after he died, members of his family were able to get a judge to just dismiss him as incompetent and let the whole will go. So his idea never happened. And if we're going to be as tidy as to give a moral to this story, we could say it is, if you want something to happen, don't wait to make it happen until after you're dead. So that was attempt number one. Civil War comes after that. And by then, the owner of this house is a Judge Rost. And he's fine with enslaved people staying enslaved. And he actually is kind of a leader in the Confederacy. He becomes the Confederacy's sort of ambassador to Spain. So while he's a supporter, he spends the war over in Europe. And while he's away, New Orleans gets occupied in 1862 by the United States. And the people who are leading the Confederacy are considered to have betrayed their country. So their land is repossessed and put to all kinds of different uses by the occupiers. In his case, this land and a house he owned in New Orleans got used by the Freedmen's Bureau, this organization that was supposed to make life better for former enslaved people, like the name suggests, but also for poor people in general, regardless of their race or their background. And so after the war, this becomes one of 4 of what they called colonies, where former enslaved people and poor folks who hadn't been enslaved could gather and basically run the plantation as a plantation, but be paid for their work, and also be able to receive medical services, education, legal aid, all of these things that basically add up to social services, which the federal government in the US had never been involved in giving up to that point. So this was a radical new thing to try to do. And while at the other 3, it didn't end up lasting very long, this one was a success. This place made a profit. And so more and more former enslaved people, people at these colonies, got sent to Destrehan because it was this working model. And then Judge Rost came back to the United States. He ended up returning, which was a surprise move in a way, because a lot of people imagined the higher leadership of the Confederacy were going to be prosecuted, at least not be given their property back. But President Andrew Johnson didn't have much appetite for that, and he gave full pardons all around. So Judge Rost ends up getting his land back, but there's an agreement made between him and the Freedmen's Bureau where they say, you can have your house in New Orleans back right away. It was functioning as a school for orphans, get them out of there. But they rented this from him for a year such that he made a profit off of basically a lot of people being hospitalized. You gotta remember, y'all, in the Civil War, 2/3 of the people in the military who died of disease, not of violence. And so the number of people hospitalized here was enormous, and it took a year to gradually clear them out. So this was a success story, actually, but a short-lived one, because ultimately property ended up going back to these Confederates. In the end, neither of these is a long-term success. They do a little bit foreshadow where Destrehan is gonna go, which is in the end, it gets bought by an oil company. And the oil company uses this land, tears down all the small buildings around the house, builds their own, and makes it into a company town. And that is actually a really common piece of the destiny of these plantation properties over time. We're gonna see a much more transparent version of that. This has ended up becoming a museum property, but that is the less common outcome. So up next, we're gonna see a town that really speaks to what modern company town looks like along the Mississippi. Y'all, this is what a company town looks like now. This is visually as different as can be, of course, from the plantation houses that have survived. But in spirit, plantations were the giant industrial sites of their day. And so this stuff is kind of a natural inheritor to all of that. So what you're seeing is part of the town of Norco. And Norco really illustrates how critical these sites have become to a lot of these towns, because it is named for one of the organizations that was established here. It wasn't always called that. It got this name because of how this became a company town. but it definitely is like intrinsic to the fiber at this point. And by and large, these were people who, before the oil and gas industry came along, were working in fishing and agriculture. And these jobs represented a huge gain in terms of steady pay and increased pay. But there also were trade-offs that came with it.
Oh, a lot of trade-offs. And one of the biggest ones is cancer. So this is actually part of Louisiana's Cancer Alley. And it's funny, it's depressing because statistic-wise, 13% of people who actually live here have reported either having a cancer currently or a form of cancer that they've gotten over. 12% of those people are non-smokers. Now, in comparison to heavily dense populated areas nearby and in the surrounding area, that's a huge number of people being infected by cancer in a small area. So this is kind of depressing. As a matter of fact, we commented when we first came out here, especially biking all day, like it smells like chemical in there. It's kind of dense and suppressing, like even being here. Can you imagine living here, especially knowing those statistics? There's been a lot of, not riots, they've been protesting Cancer Alley, especially in the communities that live near the area, because they're steadily developing this area. They're steady adding more buildings. They're steady adding more industrial complexes, like in the future. So people are angry, especially when you have relatives who have caught cancer just from living here.
And even agreeing with that, Robi, I think you and I discussed prior to coming out here, because we've grown up in the presence of these things, and I imagine this is true for a lot of the people who have, there's a strange kind of beauty about these places once it gets dark, especially, because when you're going to New Orleans or leaving New Orleans along the route that we're going to for this trip, you go across Lake Pontchartrain, and way off in the distance, you see the sparkling lights of these industrial cities, and there's something kind of mysterious about them.
It's eerie, it's mysterious, it's also kind of fascinating because as a child and you're in a car and you're riding past and you see nothing but metal and lights. That's all you see, metal lights, and then you may see some smoke or steam coming out of one of the buildings. And I don't know if you remember this, but when you're crossing Lake Pontchartrain, there's always that one with that huge fire burst coming out of it, and it lights up the entire sky. So you see this as a child, you're thinking, oh, that's where I used to think this, an advanced civilization lives, and those are the smart people of the world, and they've all congregated together because we're too unintelligent to be a part of their world. And in reality, they're just burning and making chemicals.
And it's not even just humans that this stuff affects. One of the things I learned looking into what we'd see along the way, so remember the Live Oak Society?
Oh yeah.
That the tree in Audubon Park is a part of. So the founding president of the Live Oak Society was the Loch Bro oak, which I've never seen except in photos. And it was this incredible, like 400-year-old live oak tree that was this fixture of the West Bank along here. And it died after the addition of petrochemical stuff through there from ground and water pollution, or air and water pollution. So like, it's bad for kind of everything that lives here. And the towns too, I mean, get completely taken over by this stuff. It's not unusual to pass through one of these things and see in the midst of this huge industrial site, a little moment where all of a sudden there's a church, or there's a cemetery, or there's a performing arts center like we saw coming up here, all just surrounded by a fence and with all this refinery stuff behind it. So these kind of surreal combinations where you can see this is not just a site where people work, this is where people live.
You see all these buildings and like these industrial like things, I can't even find the right words for it, and then randomly you see a church.
Yeah.
And then randomly you see a little park or a little girls' school where there's sculptures or something like that. It's a very visceral new realness that I've never experienced before.
Yeah, and you see it in detail when you do this as a bike ride and not as a drive. All of it starts to jump out a little bit more. It's very science fiction when you look at it. One of the things that I learned not too long before we did this ride is out there in New Orleans, there's an artist a pixel artist who goes by the handle of Geography of Robots, who does, especially for those of us who find this scenery weirdly beautiful to begin with, these really incredible animated pixel art interpretations of both the Louisiana swamps and these industrial sites and the combination of both. And that person has been involved in the upcoming release of an independent adventure game called Norco that is a sort of sci-fi adventure set here. And so it's kind of the fantasy of our childhoods come to life.
Yeah.
So if you're into the intersection of video gaming and critical theory and visual art and science fiction. There you go. We have one more thing we can't wait to see. We're making one last stop on this ride at the Bonnie Carre Spillway. So we're gonna be a little further up the river. Hope y'all can hang on for a little bit more pedaling.
Yes, and some possible fishing.
Y'all, we have reached the Bonnie Carre Spillway. This is where the bike path ends, and it's just straight up road from there on out. So if you're ever gonna do this bike ride, not a bad place to finish and a pretty cool thing to see. We're still right by the river, but this is kind of a still edge of the river. These form naturally, but it leads over to a kind of compound, natural, man-made creation. So back in the late 19th century, there was a crevasse in the river. The river broke its own levees and went off flowing into Lake Pontchartrain, stayed that way for many years and then was artificially closed up. But after a huge flood all up and down the Mississippi in 1927, the Army Corps of Engineers ultimately ended up building this spillway, whereby there is a man-made wall that closes in the river until it gets opened up, at which point the excess water, when the water is too high down in New Orleans, can be sent flowing off to the side into Lake Pontchartrain. So basically letting off pressure from the river when it's already at its flood stage. But it's here all the time, so people use it for lots of other things besides that.
I'm grinning for a reason, because we is near a body of water that I know you can go fishing in. At the end of this bike ride though, especially here, this is the perfect place to actually watch the sunset, because it sets right off on this little peninsula here, and you can actually see it just set. And there's water around you. Sometimes there's beavers in the area. You can see them building. You can see them just eating, hanging out. Fish are constantly jumping out here. As a matter of fact, as we were walking just now, there were fish jumping to my right, and I'm like getting anxious because I want to throw my fishing pole out there right now. But this is like, I would say, the perfect end to a levee ride out here from New Orleans all the way up. If you decide to stop here on your travels and like watch the sunset, you can bring food out here. It's free to the public. And sit down and just kind of relax and enjoy the accomplishment of biking from New Orleans to here.
And on the small chance that you end up doing that bike ride when the river is super high and needs to be opened up, which at this point is most years, more often than not, we have to open it up at least once, but it's a springtime thing generally. You would see quite a crowd out here. That's like a spectator sport, seeing the water pour off through the actual spillway structure. And so, yeah, if you get out here and there's a huge mob of people all set up with their picnics and everything else, then you're here for one of those rare special days. Maybe a time to plan a bike ride for.
Yeah.
So from here, we're still gonna be going along the river, but we've got very different means of getting there. We're gonna be switching from 2 wheels to 4. And we're gonna be headed up next step to one of the towns between here and Baton Rouge, this place called Vacherie, which is gonna get you a view of some of the plantation culture of the area. So we got lots more for y'all in the same vein of what we've been doing here, just getting into way more detail on plantations that you could visit. So we are gonna take a break and enjoy a sunset and some fish jumping.
Because my legs is tired. I'm tired. Y'all wore me out.
A moment of rest out here. Definitely recommend that when you do this ride. And y'all, let us know what you think down in the comments as usual. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, hit the like, help the world know. And we will see you soon for another episode.
And we love y'all. Always remember that. We love y'all. So y'all keep watching. We're gonna keep doing this, okay?
Thanks, y'all.
Bye. That felt okay.
Yeah. I forgot to ask for tips.
Oh, no, that's okay. Oh, don't forget the tip.
Y'all can also send us tips if you want. Look down there.